The invitation arrived on a rainy afternoon, blinking on the cracked screen of a second-hand phone like a dare disguised as kindness. The message was written in smooth, confident English, the kind used in boardrooms and glossy magazines, inviting the daughter of the cleaner to attend an exclusive charity gala at one of the city's most luxurious hotels. It said her presence would be an honor, that the host, a well-known millionaire, had taken a personal interest in her after noticing her intelligence and manners during the hours she waited in the lobby for her mother to finish work. What the message did not say was louder than what it did. In that city, everyone knew the millionaire's reputation. He was generous in public, ruthless in private, and amused by power games that allowed him to remind others of their place. He enjoyed inviting people from the margins into glittering spaces, watching them shrink under chandeliers, stumble over etiquette, and confirm the unspoken hierarchy that fed his ego. The girl read the message again and again, the rain tapping against the window like impatient fingers. She remembered sitting on cold marble floors with her school bag clutched to her chest, watching her mother mop footprints that reappeared moments later, listening to laughter float out from behind glass doors. She remembered the millionaire's shoes, always polished, always moving past them without a glance, as if they were part of the building itself. When she showed the message to her mother that evening, the small apartment filled with the smell of soap and cheap cooking oil, her mother's face tightened with worry. She knew the world too well to mistake cruelty for opportunity. She said they should decline, said nothing good ever came from being invited somewhere just to be looked at. But the girl felt something different stirring inside her, not fear, not excitement, but resolve sharpened by years of quiet observation. She had grown up learning how rooms worked, how power spoke without words, how dignity could exist even where respect was denied. She told her mother she would go, not to impress, not to beg, but to stand exactly as she was. That night, while the city buzzed outside thin walls and sirens echoed like distant warnings, she stood before a mirror that reflected a life of restraint and resilience. She saw the girl who had studied under flickering lights, who had memorized words from borrowed books, who had learned to listen more than speak because silence was often safer. She had no designer dress waiting in a closet, no jewels hidden away, no mentor to guide her through the maze of wealth. What she had was discipline. Over the following days, she prepared with an intensity that surprised even her. She visited the public library, running her fingers over spines that smelled of dust and promise, reading about art, philanthropy, and the unspoken rules of high society. She practiced posture and movement in narrow hallways, balancing books on her head, correcting herself until grace felt natural rather than forced. She observed people on buses and streets, learning how confidence lived in the body before it ever reached the face. When it came time to find something to wear, the community around her quietly stepped in. A neighbor offered deep blue fabric saved for years for a special occasion. Another lent thread that shimmered faintly under light. They stitched together late into the night, hands moving with care, the gown slowly taking shape. Not extravagant, not loud, but elegant in its simplicity. Each stitch felt like a quiet refusal to be small. As the night of the gala approached, the girl slept little, not from anxiety, but from focus. She knew the invitation was meant as a stage for her embarrassment, a moment the millionaire and his circle could later laugh about overexpensive drinks. But she also knew something he did not. Humiliation only works when accepted. When the evening finally arrived, she stepped out into the city air, rain washed clean, lights shimmering like possibilities. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked toward the glowing hotel not as the cleaner's daughter, not as a guest meant to be tested, but as a young woman fully aware of her worth, ready to enter a room that believed it owned her story, unaware that it was about to be rewritten. The moment she stepped through the revolving doors, the world inside the hotel felt like a different climate, warm and perfumed, humming with low laughter and the clink of crystal glasses. Marble floors reflected light so brightly it felt as if the ground itself were watching. For a heartbeat, no one noticed her. Conversations flowed, heels clicked, and waiters moved like shadows between clusters of wealth and confidence. Then something shifted. It was subtle at first, like a pause in music, an almost imperceptible hesitation that spread from one group to another as eyes began to turn. She walked with calm, unhurried steps, the deep blue gown flowing around her as if it belonged to her body rather than the other way around. There was no stiffness in her posture, no anxious scanning for approval. She carried herself with a quiet authority that did not demand attention, but claimed it naturally. Whispers stirred, not sharp or mocking as the millionaire had expected, but curious, admiring, surprised. The chandeliers caught the fabric of her dress, drawing out soft highlights that made her seem almost luminous. And for the first time that evening, the carefully rehearsed energy of the room fractured. The millionaire, standing near the center with a practiced smile fixed on his face, felt it before he saw it. He sensed the shift in focus, the way laughter thinned and eyes slid past him toward the entrance. When he finally turned and saw her, his expression faltered, just for a second, but long enough to register as confusion. This was not the awkward girl he had imagined, not the spectacle he had prepared for. She did not look overwhelmed by the grandeur, nor did she look grateful in the way he preferred. She looked as if she belonged. As she moved deeper into the ballroom, guests began to approach her, offering compliments that were careful at first, then increasingly sincere. She thanked them with warmth, meeting each gaze directly, answering questions with clarity and poise. When someone asked where she had studied, she spoke honestly, without apology, about public schools, scholarships, and long nights of self-study, turning what was meant to be a quiet test into a statement of strength. A well-known art collector commented on a painting displayed near the bar, and she responded with insight drawn from countless hours spent in free museums, her observations sharp enough to draw impressed nods. The room, which had been arranged to showcase wealth, now found itself orbiting a different kind of presence. Music drifted from the orchestra, and as she passed, even the musicians seemed to play with a softer attentiveness, as though aware they were accompanying something rare. The millionaire forced himself to recover, stepping forward with a host's charm polished to a mirror shine. He greeted her loudly, theatrically, ensuring nearby guests could hear, and thanked her for accepting his invitation, his words layered with a tone that suggested ownership. She smiled, thanked him in return, and her voice, steady, respectful, unyielding, cut through his performance. She spoke of the charity, of its importance, of the people whose lives it touched, redirecting attention away from herself and back to purpose. Guests listened, some surprised to hear such depth from someone they had unconsciously labeled an experiment. The millionaire felt the ground shift again, the evening slipping further from his control. As dinner was announced, she was guided to a table reserved for influential donors and public figures, a placement he had arranged partly to heighten her discomfort. Instead, she settled into the seat with ease, engaging in conversation that flowed naturally, asking thoughtful questions, listening with intent, offering insights shaped by lived experience rather than privilege. When a guest made a subtle remark about backgrounds and knowing one's place, she responded with a gentle smile and a story about her mother's work, about the discipline and dignity required to clean spaces others took for granted. Her words carried no bitterness, only truth, and the table fell quiet before responding with thoughtful murmurs of agreement. The millionaire watched from across the room, his glass untouched, his reflection warped in its surface. He saw guests lean toward her, saw laughter rise where tension had been expected, saw admiration replace curiosity. Each minute felt like a quiet undoing of the narrative he had written. The girl he had invited to be humiliated had become the axis of the evening, not through defiance or spectacle, but through an unshakable sense of self. As the first course was cleared and applause rose for a brief speech about generosity and vision, the room seemed to glow differently, less like a display of power and more like a gathering drawn towards something authentic. And in that glow, the millionaire felt a tightening in his chest, a realization he resisted but could not escape. The evening was no longer about him, and the humiliation he had planned was unfolding somewhere else entirely, quiet, invisible, and deeply his own. The night continued with an energy that refused to bend to expectation, each moment revealing the growing gravity of her presence. The ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and polished floors, was designed to impress, to remind every guest of wealth and influence. Yet she moved through it, as if those trappings were inconsequential, invisible except as a backdrop to her own dignity. Conversations swirled around her, guests leaning in not out of polite curiosity but genuine interest, their smiles no longer coated with condescension. She spoke of the charity's mission, weaving stories of real people whose lives had been touched by its programs, and her words carried weight because they were rooted in empathy, in experience, in knowledge gleaned not from prestige, but from observing and surviving the world on its raw terms. A philanthropist known for scrutinizing potential partners approached her, expecting to test her intelligence or patience, but instead found himself engaged in discussion that was sharp, nuanced, and compelling, revealing perspectives he had not anticipated. She referenced books she had borrowed, exhibitions she had visited for free, lectures she had attended online, and every answer was precise, full of insight, yet delivered with a grace that disarmed rather than dominated. She laughed when something genuinely amused her, soft and unaffected, a sound that drew others to lean closer, curious and receptive. The millionaire, standing across the room, felt an unfamiliar sensation prick at the edges of his ego. He had orchestrated an evening where she would be measured, compared, and ultimately diminished, yet he found himself reacting instead of acting. Each guest she engaged with seemed to forget the social hierarchy he had so meticulously maintained. Her presence reshaped it with subtle authority. When a well-meaning but socially sharp investor attempted a subtle dig, referencing her modest background, she replied not with defensiveness but with intelligence and elegance, turning the comment into an opportunity to highlight the value of determination, education, and character over birthright. The laughter that followed was inclusive, warm, and entirely of her making, leaving the investor momentarily speechless, caught in the brightness of her composure. He realized then that she was dismantling the very spectacle he had intended without raising a hand, without needing anyone's pity, without performing or exaggerating. Her interactions were a masterclass in quiet power, a display of dignity and intelligence that illuminated every corner of the room. Servers moved around them, glasses clinking, and for a brief moment the millionaire imagined the city beyond the windows, its noise, its chaos, its inequities, and saw, reflected in her eyes, the truth of his own limitations. He had believed that influence, money, and spectacle could command attention, that people were malleable under the right circumstances. Tonight, he learned otherwise. She walked to the center of the room when the music swelled for the first dance, not to perform, but to exist fully in the space, and every step she took drew eyes without effort. Guests stopped mid-conversation to observe, and even those accustomed to dominance felt themselves yielding to the presence of someone who required no validation. She smiled politely at the millionaire when their paths crossed, a gesture of civility and recognition, yet it carried no subservience, no need for his approval. The ballroom had become a theater where she alone dictated the scene, and the irony was both subtle and absolute. He had invited her to be humiliated, yet she radiated a confidence that made the entire room feel simultaneously lighter and more attentive. A journalist at a nearby table scribbled notes furiously, sensing that this young woman's story would resonate far beyond the evening, that her composure, insight, and unshakable poise were a kind of currency the millionaire could not manipulate. When dinner was served, she navigated the formalities with ease, engaging guests in conversation that ranged from art to social responsibility, always listening, always responding with clarity. Each anecdote she shared was carefully chosen to illuminate her perspective, but never to boast. She made connections effortlessly, leaving an impression of someone who had arrived not by chance, but through intelligence, resilience, and grace. The millionaire, by contrast, felt increasingly invisible, a spectator to a performance he had never anticipated, one in which he played no part other than as an observer. He watched as she redirected compliments toward her mother, toward the workers, toward the charity itself, ensuring that attention remained grounded in purpose rather than spectacle. And in every glance, every nod, every soft word, the room acknowledged her sovereignty, her authority, her right to be there on her own terms. By the time the main course was cleared, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Conversations that had begun as polite exchange now carried respect, admiration, and genuine interest. The millionaire realized that his plan to humiliate had utterly failed, replaced by a force of quiet inspiration he had underestimated. She had transformed the event into something larger than herself, something that transcended wealth, status, and expectation, a space where presence, intellect, and moral strength were the true currency. And in that realization, he felt an unfamiliar humility, a weight in his chest that neither pride nor money could counter, as he recognized that the young woman he had intended to diminish had instead illuminated the emptiness of his own superiority. As the night drew on, the gala began to wind down, yet the energy she had brought into the room remained palpable, like a faint hum that lingered long after music fades. Guests, previously preoccupied with status and appearances, found themselves drawn again and again to her presence, seeking her insight, her opinion, and, above all, her authenticity. She moved among them with a natural ease that seemed impossible to fabricate, as if she were born to navigate these spaces, not to impress, but simply to exist fully, and in doing so, shift the atmosphere around her. The millionaire, who had spent hours calculating his guests' impressions, orchestrating every detail to ensure her discomfort, now felt a strange dislocation, a sensation he had rarely experienced: irrelevance. The room no longer obeyed his design, his careful choreography of influence and social positioning disrupted by someone who required no permission to shine. He watched as she engaged a group of patrons discussing investment in the charity, listening first with patience, asking incisive questions, then offering suggestions drawn from her own understanding of community needs and personal experience. Each word she spoke carried gravity, not because of wealth or pedigree, but because of its honesty and clarity. Even the most jaded of attendees leaned in, captivated, their attention riveted not on glittering displays or titles, but on her presence. At one point, a renowned socialite attempted a pointed remark about her modest upbringing, a comment meant to underscore hierarchy and remind everyone of her place, but she responded with a soft smile and a measured, insightful answer that reframed the entire conversation. She spoke of resilience, empathy, and the dignity inherent in labor, illuminating her mother's sacrifices and turning what could have been embarrassment into a testament to strength. Laughter and nods followed her words, not patronizing, but genuine, and the socialite, caught off guard, could only smile politely, a subtle acknowledgement of being outmatched. The millionaire's mind raced. He realized that the spectacle he had intended, the humiliation carefully designed to amuse and reaffirm his superiority, had been completely inverted. Guests whispered to one another, impressed not by wealth or influence, but by her presence, her intellect, and the quiet command she wielded without arrogance. Cameras flashed, capturing images of a woman who seemed almost mythic in her poise, yet entirely human in her warmth and engagement. He noticed small details he had never expected to matter: the way she tilted her head thoughtfully while listening, the subtle gestures of acknowledgement she offered to servers and organizers, the steadiness of her gaze when addressing a crowded room. Each movement conveyed confidence, purpose, and grace, qualities that no gown or jewel could fabricate, yet which outshone everything else in the room. As the evening approached its final hours, the millionaire attempted to regain some control, stepping forward to offer a private word, a suggestion of mentorship, a proposition of opportunity framed in the language of influence and wealth. She listened carefully, her face composed, eyes reflecting both gratitude and discernment. When she spoke, she thanked him politely, acknowledging his invitation and the visibility it had granted, but she clarified that her path would be guided by her own choices, by principles rather than patronage. Her words landed with a quiet authority, leaving him without response, without leverage, without the satisfaction he had anticipated. She excused herself to find her mother, who had arrived late, still carrying the traces of her day's labor, yet radiating pride. Their embrace was simple, human, and in that moment, the room seemed to pause, the previous tension dissolving into warmth. Guests clapped spontaneously, not out of mockery or convention, but in recognition of the genuine connection, the triumph of resilience and authenticity over artifice. The millionaire, standing slightly apart, observed silently, his usual confidence tempered by an unexpected humility. He had intended to orchestrate humiliation, but he had become a witness to something far greater. The revelation that dignity and intelligence cannot be scripted or bought, and that grace can render power impotent when wielded without conscience. The evening's conclusion came quietly, with guests departing in waves, conversations lingering in hallways and foyers, the memory of her presence leaving a subtle mark on all who had seen it. She walked out into the night with her mother at her side, not as a figure defined by wealth or expectation, but as a young woman fully aware of her own strength and capacity, carrying herself with certainty and quiet triumph. The millionaire remained in the ballroom, the glittering chandeliers reflecting his own contemplative expression, the echo of the evening's lessons settling in his chest. The gala, designed to assert control, had instead illuminated a truth he had long overlooked. Influence is transient, status is conditional, but integrity, intelligence, and the courage to claim one's place in the world are invincible. In that realization, he found a kind of revelation more profound than any applause, more enduring than any display of wealth, a recognition that for the first time, someone had shown him the limits of his own power and the extraordinary potential of another human being to rise above expectation and judgment.